upwards of 20,000 people, give or take, that are in state custody as we speak. The amount of death, rapid drug abuse, murders, suicides that happen in these prisons.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We have on the line John Glenn from the Alabama Political Reporter. He is, he writes on a lot of stuff, but he is the most consistent writer, I think probably in Alabama, on the state of our prisons. And so we wanted to talk to him about the latest on that. John, thanks for jumping on the show this morning. Appreciate it.
No, of course, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So first off, you mentioned this Frederick Bishop. He is a fellow who was denied parole 10 days after he died. Why would that be the case?
Well, there are several contributing factors to this mistake, whether with it happening. It's really kind of a communication nightmare, honestly, in the aftermath of all of this, because I honestly think that both the Alabama Department of Corrections and the Parole Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, are essentially trying to trade off blame in this particular instance, because both don't want to admit that a communication breakdown is more than likely what led to this happening. Essentially, he dies 10 days prior to his parole hearing, and 30 days prior to your parole hearing, a officer with the Bureau called an IPO, which stands for incarcerate. No, that's not it. It's internal parole officer. Yes, that's what it is. They essentially come in and they give an assessment of whomever is coming up for parole based on, like, are they at risk for flight? And they just give an interview. It's confidential, and so the only people that really get that information are the Bureau. But nonetheless, 30 days is that window where that IPO is supposed to meet with him. So this would have had to have been after that hearing with the IPO. So a spokesman with the ADOC told me after this article was published, because initially they just said, well, it was a mistake. We'll take steps to rectify this particular mistake. And I was told by a couple of different people that essentially when something like this happens, or rather something like this really doesn't happen, but if someone is up for their parole hearing, a death certificate, and they die prior to that, like a death certificate is supposed to reach the Bureau somehow. That really isn't the case. What happened? There's like a daily, I think it's a nightly log actually that the ADOC updates that shows. I don't know exactly what it shows, but it has to show who died that particular day or that particular week or something like that. And the Bureau is supposed to take that information and update the dockets accordingly. Obviously, that didn't happen. Now, that bit about the nightly log is what the ADOC spokesperson told me after the fact. And again, it's just it's a communication breakdown. That's what happened. And this egregious mistake is allowed to continue. And I had a couple of people that at least they work for the Bureau tell me that, stuff like this, they've just never seen it happen. And they, again, chalk it up to communications and a sort of bureaucratic failure on the part of both entities. But I suppose that's a rounded answer to that particular question.
Yeah, well, and I think it's, I don't doubt that there was a communications failure, but also the idea that he's dead and he's being denied parole, that's also kind of indicative of the state of our Bureau of Pardons and Paroles,
right,
that they give out so few paroles. Talk to us about. Can you talk to us about? And I didn't think to prep you for this question. So this is a new question, and so if you don't have the information offhand, that's fine. But do you know offhand, like, what the percentage is of people who do actually get paroles, and I know that it's small, and so why is it so small?
So for last year, it was 10%. 10% of those eligible received their parole, which when you compare it to like the 5 years prior, 5 years prior, it was like over half of those eligible were approved for parole, and now it's just 10%. For this year, it's 6%, which out of the given like 1,400 folks that were eligible, and this current fiscal year, that's like almost 100, maybe less. And again, that's the reasons behind it are, well, I don't know. I frankly don't know, because it doesn't seem very like rational, this whole deal. It's entirely possible that it's to do with a vengeful board that simply wants to keep people in prison. It could just be that there are stricter criteria for parole than there used to be. I don't have that information in front of me, but I mean, it's obvious that there's if there's not a concerted effort, there's at least a allowance of this low a percentage of folks to go up for their parole. This is actually something I remember it's about 2 days ago during the regular session in Montgomery, where they were discussing a bill to cut good time incentives, which had just happened somewhat recently. It passed the Senate. It's going to the House for consideration, but they were debating it in the Senate. And Minority Leader Bobby Singleton, he come up and he said that essentially this focus on good time and cutting it was to do with how little parole was being given out to folks, and that this really wouldn't be a topic of discussion had it not been for the fact that the state parole board just doesn't let people out of prison. So reasons behind it, it's, you have to ask those folks, and, the attempts that's been made really hasn't given any sort of concerted answer on that. It's egregious is what it is.
Well, and this another, so an effort to cut the amount of good time eligibility, you said passed the Senate, but one of the reasons for that is that as I understand it, is that there's this understanding on right-wing talk radio that our legal system is just simply too liberal. I've even heard comparisons to like, we are, our prisons are like more liberal than New York or California or whatever. And I don't know what the laws are in New York or California, but it just seems patently absurd. The idea that 6-7% of people eligible for parole are getting parole, and we have more prisoners than the average state. I think one of the highest per capita prison populations in the country, and then our country has the highest per capita prison population in the history of the world. We lock up more people in prison than the Soviet Union did in the gulags, right? I mean, this is, just a remarkably just a remarkable system of incarceration. But there's this idea that we're just simply, the problem is that we don't lock enough humans in cages. And I'm sorry, that was kind of a rant, but like, how does that vision of our prison system match with reality?
Well, you said it quite literally about, if for instance, we had more liberal policies, I don't think you would see 10% of folks last year being let out on parole, meaning those eligible being let out on parole. I don't think you would see the mass incarceration that you see, where it's upwards of 20,000 people, give or take, that are in state custody as we speak. The amount of death, rampant drug abuse, murders, suicides that happen in these prisons, and that's chalked up to liberal policies. Again, like all of the stuff that the state has done to organize the prisons, to create the current prison system that we have. In a lot of ways, it's also what they haven't done, is in some ways a reaction to like previous tough on crime policies of the 20th century, the later half of the 20th century, all of which I'd imagine the talk show radio host that you're mentioning would be more in favor of, would absolutely be in support of. In
Right.
anyways, depending on how old they are, probably like pontificated on during this particular period.
Right.
But the thing about that good time incentive thing that just passed the Senate, of course, that was actually, it was specifically to do with one instance of a fellow that was let out on good time, who then goes to, after about 2 months after he's released from state custody, ends up in Bibb County and shoots two sheriff's deputies in Bibb County, one of whom dies. I think it was Brad Johnson. In that instance, according to state code, according to the rules set in place already for doling out good time to incarcerated individuals, that this fellow, his name was Austin Patrick Hall, shouldn't have been released to begin with. He shouldn't have been allowed to accrue good time. He had escaped at one point from a Camden work release center in Wilcox County, and then during that escape ended up in Oxford, stole I think it was a City of Oxford Ford Explorer or something like that. It was a truck of some kind or a car of some kind. Drives it into Georgia, leads a multi-agency chase into a neighboring state. He's brought back in and placed in the county jail, and still allowed to accrue good time, and still allowed to get let out. When in fact, what should have happened is that good time should have been forfeited, and that's under the state's own policy. Granted, the good time policies were very ill defined, and Ivey sent out, I believe this in January, an executive order that better defined them and added uniform standards for them. But nonetheless, that's a failure of the state. That instance is a failure of state. It's not a failure of policy, because again, we're talking about a incentive program that only 13% of those currently incarcerated are eligible for in the first place. And so, this is kind of ridiculous, frankly.
Yeah. It seems that way to me. And so, there are, like you said, and like I said, there are lots of people in prisons. And so talk to us about the state of our prisons. One of the, a very kind of archetypal John Glenn article is inmate dies at such and such prison. I mean, those articles come out so often. How are these deaths happening? And Frederick Bishop, I don't know the conditions of his death, but how are these deaths happening, and what are the rates of inmate deaths, and then how are they how do you compare that to the rest of the country?
Okay, so first to answer the middle part of the question, because I think that'd probably be the best way to introduce this. I think since the last time we spoke, at least the last time I was on this show, which I believe was in October, 66 incarcerated individuals have died in ADOC custody.
Wow.
And within that period, in the week of Thanksgiving, nine incarcerated individuals died at 6 different correctional facilities. The day after Thanksgiving would be November the 25th, 5 individuals. Barry Christopher Culver, Albert Jackson Sorrells, Jimmy R. Hurst, and Jason Hopkins, and then there's one other individual, I think. I seem to remember, but I can't remember his name. All died that same day. And among those, for instance, Albert Jackson Sorrells, he's like 57 at the time of his death at Ventress. He was quite literally left to rot on his bunk. And this is according to the Montgomery Advertiser, Evan Molinas, who's an excellent writer on the subject. He did a story about this. Also, among those deaths was a 22-year-old named Cameron Holyfield, who, after he died, and apparently the autopsy shows that it was an overdose, he was buried at Limestone Correctional Facility at a pauper's grave without consent or knowledge of his family. Now, he had died at Staten Correctional Facility, which is like 170 miles to the south, give or take, on Thanksgiving Day. And he gets buried all the way up in the north bit of the state in a pauper's grave, and nobody knew about it. None of his family members knew about it. And this is all, by the way, when they are primarily located in Mobile County, give or take. And then I believe his stepmother lives out west someplace. And so it was my understanding, at least ADOC policy was that you're supposed, if the family can't afford a grave, and the state gives them one, it's supposed to be placed at a location where it's convenient for them to visit. But, by every indication that, they didn't get in contact with them. And like so often this happens, another incarcerated individual who was in Staten with Mr. Holyfield notified his mother, called her in the early morning that Thanksgiving saying, "Hey, your son just died." Also, there was that particular week, there was an overdose, I seem to remember, of a 20-year-old who he had overdosed that week and taken to an area hospital where he recovered and was returned back to prison. His name was Eddie Richmond. And then I think less than a month later in December, he ends up dying. And, I haven't gotten an official autopsy on that, so I can't speak to the manner of his death. But, in total from last year, it was, I believe, 270 people died.
Wow.
And that's according to statistics from the ODC that the Montgomery Advertiser obtained. And so far this year, it's been 31 fatalities. That both of these numbers, like last year's numbers may be more concrete, but especially this year's numbers shouldn't be taken at face value. Those numbers will most likely go up. But, last year was already the largest loss of life in state corrections history since 2002, which, if I'm not mistaken, was when they started taking stock of like how many people were actually dying in prison. I have no way to verify that last bit of, but at least since 2002, which is what Appleseed said. So as to the manner, I seem to remember the Equal Justice Initiative estimated in December of last year that of the folks that had died that year, 18 had died of homicide, 23 were suspected fatal overdoses. Again, these are most likely higher. And, there was a vigil, there was a rally that was held during the State of the State in Montgomery, and Lauren Farina, who's the director of the Woods Foundation, she said that the state of Alabama not only has the highest in-custody death rate in the country, but also the highest in-custody murder rate and the highest in-custody suicide rate of any state in the union. And, given who she is, I absolutely believe that's the case. As to, how this keeps happening, it goes back to the overcrowded nature of the facilities, the fact that there are very few correctional officers actually there, present, doing their jobs in those particular facilities. They're overworked, underpaid, even with the wage increases and such. These facilities are dilapidated beyond recognition in some cases, where you have hundreds and hundreds of people crammed up into dorms, sleeping on top of each other. And this is allowed to persist for years. I hope I answered all the facets.
Yeah, no, you did.
And more or less, that's it.
Yeah, and one of the ways that Alabama politicians are seeking to remedy this issue is by building a huge mega prison. What are your thoughts on the degree to which that will help the problem?
Well, it's not going to increase bed space. That's already been proven.
Wow, really?
Most of I can't remember exactly the metrics, but the two new facilities won't increase. Well, they'll increase it, but it'll still be overcrowded, is what I'm saying.
Right. Okay.
I have to go back and look at that particular metric because Josh Moon, our columnist, was the one who found that out. I haven't been able to find that just yet. Regardless, one of the lines from Democratic Party members in both the House and the Senate when the initial funding package was going through was that, look, you're not going to fix the culture of this. I mean, you may make some nice spangly new prisons that have all sorts of different, extracurricular activity rooms, rehab facilities, whatever. But at the end of the day, they weren't convinced that this was going to fix the underlying problems of a culture that allows this to happen.
And John,
I don't think it. Go ahead, son.
I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is the Department of Justice has also been pretty clear that you simply can't build your way out of the problems that they've identified.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And again, I can't name personally an instance of a state building mega prisons and being able to dig their way out of a horrendously violent and lethal correction system. I can't name a state that has been able to do that just by building new prisons. That being said, it's true to say that like these facilities need to be at least renovated at the very least, and that new facilities probably should be built in place of older facilities. But that's one of maybe 4 problems, like critical problems that just building new prison facilities will not fix.
And speaking of building new prison facilities, the price tag of this new mega prison has increased by an inordinate amount. Talk to us, how much has the price increased by, and how did that happen?
So it is increased. They set the cap at $975 million, so it's nearly $1 billion. And the original cap, which I swear to God I knew at some point, it's 600 and something odd billion. So it's increased almost by 50%, give or take.
Wow.
And the reasoning behind that, at least as I've been able to conjure, both it was Speaker Ledbetter and State Senator Greg Alburton, after the special session on ALPR funds finished, they cited inflation, i.e. price increases, as the reason that the construction, specifically the Elmore site, was going up. The price of that was going up. Undoubtedly, this is most likely a factor, but like after that, we kind of have to delve into more or less the speculative side, because so the funds come from state general fund budget, as well as a $400 million injection from COVID monies. And then, of course, there's the bond issue that came out. So that state bond issue fell short of its initial value, like something like $200 million or something like that. So it generated only $409 million in funds out of a bond issue that was supposed to be like $750 million. So that's one thing that could be to offset the downfalls of that bond issue. Another thing, it could be something to do, frankly, with the construction of it. There's something at the site that is causing this construction to inflate price-wise because of unforeseen structural issue, for instance, they had to take care of. I put a story in, I believe it was in January, where 2 separate people with knowledge of this particular construction site in Elmore County said that there were multiple sinkholes found at these sites, and that's caused work to be stopped and environmental assessment to come on the underlying soil and on this to be conducted. And that the preliminary results of that examination said that it was like an underground stream system or something running beneath the construction site. I have never been able to confirm this with the ADOC because they vehemently denied it initially, and they still deny it. That there were no sinkholes, work has not stopped. Commissioner John Hamm and Senate Minority Leader Bobby Singleton both also said that that wasn't the case. I mean, Singleton said he personally went out to the site and said there were no sinkholes. There's no structures being built at the facility at the moment. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's rather that there hasn't been any meaningful construction of the site in terms of buildings. There isn't. You go there and it's a flat field, massive area, where at least the last time I was there, there's a sort of a moat running around it, and there's water collected at the far end of that moat. There's flags placed out there. There's Cadell construction trailers that are on site. There's tractors. I mean, the last major bit of construction where you could visibly see people out there was when a construction company in Montgomery came out and leveled that whole area, flattened the land for the construction. Now, I haven't been there in a while. I haven't been there since January, so things might have changed. That being said, last time I was there, there was no meaningful indication that work was being done. And if work was being done, it wasn't it just wasn't being done in the manner in which I think the state anticipated to. So yeah.
Gotcha. Well, John, is there anything else that you think that we haven't hit on that you think is important for folks to know about the state of our prisons or our legal system?
I mean, just that they continue to be deadly and not cost effective. We have an incarcerated population that is growing increasingly old. Not a lot of people are being let out of prison, and this narrative that it's to do with liberal policies, especially, or policies that don't fall within the purview of a tough on crime stance, is ridiculous. Frankly, it's ridiculous. But other than that, I think that more or less covers it.
John Glenn, reporter for the Alabama Political Reporter. We appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for talking to us.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Yep.
Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.